Audiobook Academy Biography presents A. Philip Randolph. To ensure that African Americans had fair access to the benefits of the labor movement, A. Philip Randolph became a trailblazing leader, organizer, and social activist in the early part of the 20th century. In addition to being a labor leader, A. Philip Randolph was a social activist. Randolph tried to organize African American shipyard workers and elevator operators during World War I, and he co-founded a periodical aimed at promoting a higher standard of living. He went on to form the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first official African American labor union, in 1937. With his organizational skills at their peak, Randolph became a driving force in desegregating government defense manufacturing and eliminating race discrimination in the military, both of which were done by presidential edict. He was a key organizer of the March on Washington in 1963 after becoming more interested in civil rights activism. Early childhood and family history. Asa Philip Randolph was born in Crescent City, Florida, on April 15, 1889. Elizabeth and James Randolph, both of whom were ardent champions of equal rights for African Americans as well as human rights in general, raised their second son, James Randolph Jr. It was not until 1891 that Randolph's family made the trip from Virginia to Florida, where he would spend much of his adolescence and attend the Cookman Institute, one of the country's earliest historically black colleges. Organizer of workers. Randolph moved to New York City's Harlem district in 1911 after graduating from Cookman College, where he contemplated becoming an actor. As he worked his way through City College, where he majored in English literature and sociology while honing his rhetorical chops as an elevator operator, porter, and waiter. When Randolph created the Brotherhood of Labor with Chandler Owen, a Columbia University law student who shared Randolph's socialist political ideas, in 1912, he made one of his earliest significant political efforts. A protest against their awful living conditions was the start of his activism while working as a waiter on a coast steamer. His first theatrical endeavor was the founding of Ye Friends of Shakespeare in Harlem in 1913 after his marriage to erudite Howard University alumna and beauty store magnate Lucille Green. In the group's later shows, he would take on a variety of roles. The Messenger was the name of Randolph and Owen's political publication during World War I in 1917. As a result, they began publishing articles urging the inclusion of more black people in the military and the war industry, and requesting higher compensation for those who work in these fields. While he was in New York, Randolph also worked to organize African American shipyard workers in Virginia and elevator operators in New York. Randolph went on to teach at the Rand School of Social Science after the war. As a Socialist Party candidate in New York in the early 1920s, he was unsuccessful. Randolph's belief in the power of unions to enhance the economic and social status of African Americans would grow stronger over time. Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was created by Randolph in 1925. For most of his term in office as president, he worked hard to get the union recognized by the American Federation of Labor, whose branches at the time routinely banned membership to African Americans. The Pullman Company, which at the time employed the majority of black workers, was a major opponent of the BSCP. But Randolph persisted, and the BSCP became the first African American labor organization in the United States when it was admitted to the AFL in 1937. It wasn't until the following year that Randolph decided to leave the AFL and focus on the federal government, citing continued discrimination within its ranks. Protests in the thousands against federal laws. When Randolph tried to influence the federal government's policy in the 1940s, he organized large protests to do it. After the United States entered World Military II, he planned a march on Washington to protest racial discrimination in the workforce of the war industries. Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an executive order prohibiting racial discrimination in federal military factories and establishing the first Fair Employment Practices Committee. Randolph canceled the march because of this. Randolph organized the League for Nonviolent Civil Disobedience against military segregation following World War II. Finally, President Truman issued an executive order in 1948 outlawing the practice of racial segregation in the United States Armed Forces. Efforts to improve civil rights. Randolph became a vice president of the AFL-CIO in 1955 after the unions combined, Congress of Industrial Organizations. In 1959, he created the Negro American Labor Council in protest of the pervasive racial prejudice he observed in the organization, much to the chagrin of union leader George Meany. Additionally, Randolph began devoting more time and energy to broader civil rights causes at this period. A prayer pilgrimage to Washington, D.C., was organized by him in 1957 in an attempt to raise attention to the fact that school desegregation was still being delayed in the South. Toward the close of the decade, he organized the youth marches for integrated schools. As a leader of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, Randolph was responsible for organizing a nearly 250,000-strong gathering. As Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" address just a few days before the march, his wife Lucille had died. After the march, a small group of civil rights leaders, including King and Randolph, met with President John F. Kennedy. Randolph interrupted Kennedy as he was discussing the possibility of a congressional campaign to expand the Civil Rights Bill. "Then it will be a crusade. And nobody but you, Mr. President, do I believe, can lead this crusade." This and other civil rights achievements earned Randolph the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Lyndon B. Johnson the following year. The A. Philip Randolph Institute, which he co-founded with his mentor Bayard Rustin and set out to explore the roots of poverty, was established shortly after that. In 1965, he suggested the Freedom Budget for all Americans at a White House conference as a means of eradicating poverty in the United States. Retirement and the end of life. Randolph, who had been president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters for more than 40 years, stepped down in 1968 due to health issues related to his heart and blood pressure. His retirement from public life was also announced at the time. He relocated from Harlem to New York City's Chelsea neighborhood after he was robbed by 3 men. For the next few years, Randolph wrote his memoirs until his health deteriorated and he had to quit because he had no interest in worldly possessions or property ownership. On May 16, 1979, at the age of 90, Randolph died peacefully in bed at his New York City apartment. The A. Philip Randolph Institute in Washington, D.C., is where his cremated remains were placed. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.